But as Christians, we do humility and guilt very well. And if we have to do anything else, it's a problem. But the other thing that we have in common, I think, one thing that we have in common is the covenant. And I mean this with all sincerity. I think we sometimes forget that we are covenant people. We are people who are based on agreements, on relationships. And as I look around at other world religions, I don't wish to denigrate anybody, but I think this is something that we particularly have in common. We think of our relationship with God, but also with humanity. And these are the 2 points. I was speaking this morning in a church, and I was explaining to them how the saying that they know so well from the New Testament, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself, actually didn't begin with Christians at all. And so our faiths are about understanding. And the question we want to ask is, how can we be fellow workers? How can we come together as 2 very different people, but with a desire, a real desire to be together? How can we be fellow workers? We have a mission in common, which Sister Margaret Shepherd, who would love to have been here today, always pointed out to me that this principle of tikkun olam, to mend the world, is one that we have in common. And how can we do this and be of real benefit in a wounded world? It so needs this. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Jane. It's a great pleasure to be speaking alongside you. And thanks to Richard and Margaret and Lynn and David. Harry and Rose, as Richard said, were friends of my parents, Willie and Joe. And I was very proud to be asked to contribute to Harry's Festschrift a few years ago, and to be here with you and so many people that I know as well, and dignified guests as well. One day, a travelling circus came to town. Its star was a lion kept in a cage 30 meters long, 30 meters wide. For hour upon hour each day, the lion paced up and down, back and forth, and one night it broke loose from its cage. His escape was soon discovered and the search was on. Before long, he was discovered. Strangely enough, he'd only gone a few streets away and was in a courtyard 30 meters long and 30 meters wide. The lion was pacing up and down, back and forth, continuing the same monotonous yet comfortable habit of lateral motion. Free, and yet at the same time not free at all. For whenever he reached the corner of the courtyard, the exit just at hand, within touching distance, he reversed his direction. Having broken out of one cage, he simply found another. So I want to ask whether we, like that lion, have broken out of one cage, traveling along roads of new understandings between Christians and Jews, but have not truly escaped. Have we mistaken lateral motion for forward movement? More on breaking out of the cage in a moment. As a Jewish scholar engaged in the study and teaching of Jewish, Christian and Muslim relations for over 25 years, I've thought a great deal about the past, the present, the future, especially in relation to anti-Semitism and prejudice, as well as the interpretation of scriptures and interfaith dialogue. And I'm going to touch on those three. But let me first define what I mean by dialogue, which is often both misconstrued and ill-defined, a casual conversation that may add up to no more than a loose restatement of entrenched theological positions. That's not dialogue. Nor is dialogue synonymous with communication, a message on Facebook or Instagram. For dialogue to take place, there must be a genuine hearing of the other. The word derives from the Greek logos, often translated as word, but which can also mean a way of interpreting the world. And the other element of dialogue, dia, means through. So dialogos, or dialogue, means arguing a worldview through to a conclusion or a series of conclusions. And it's not a modern concept. The Abrahamic faiths and their scriptures encourage meaningful meetings, not merely courteous and neighborly ones. We have an example of dialogue in the New Testament, and the New Testament account of Paul's journeys. When he entered into the synagogue in Ephesus, he is recorded in the book of Acts as, and I quote, arguing and pleading about the kingdom of God. The word arguing in the RSV is arguably a rather fierce translation. The Greek word is dialegomonos, which has the connotation of a rather more careful and courteous listening than argue carries. Indeed, Paul spent 3 months in the synagogue, and if he'd spent all that time arguing rather than dialoguing, it's likely he would have been ejected much earlier than he was. This New Testament account of Paul the Jew, parallels the Jewish tendency towards what I might call an active rather than passive dialogue, which is why we Jews coined the phrase arguments for the sake of heaven. My point, though, is not just to endorse dialogue for the sake of dialogue. My point is that dialogue is central to human life, the very structure of human thought, and in the Kessler household, at least, the standard form of response to anything. Dialogue is good news. In a world fractured by abrasiveness and aggressiveness, it is one way to delegitimize the present lethal combination of religious fundamentalism, nationalist chauvinism, and political demagoguery. How? Because dialogue generally means being open to different points of view. If a few more of us were willing to stand up and dialogue, we'd be better able to withstand the dogmatists and fundamentalists growling in their Twitter feed. There aren't many of them. They just happen to be loud. You know the type. People who have the unshakable conviction that in their sacred text or in their political ideologies, they possess the whole truth and nothing but the truth, with the reassuring consequence that their side is always right and the opposing argument invariably and inevitably wrong. Nowhere is this found more than in the polarizing discussions today about Israel and Palestine. Speakers tend to be advocates of one side or another, pursuing a strictly partisan agenda, whether they meet in synagogues, mosques, or in churches, in universities, or at workplaces, or during marches and demonstrations. The atrocities committed by Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October and the extreme severity of the Israeli military response have brought huge pressures on Jewish-Christian relations today, and especially on the Jewish and Muslim communities, with a 12-fold reported instance of increase in anti-Semitism and a 7-fold increase of Islamophobic ones in the UK alone. And this brings particular challenges to this conversation. For example, when I invite people to a dialogue, they often arrive with their views and opinions already clear in their own mind. So they are rather perturbed when I welcome them by saying, I hope they leave more confused than when they arrived. The problem with their partisan self-assurance is that it affects their ability to take seriously alternative opinions and, most importantly, to engage in dialogue, which makes the search for mutual understanding much more difficult. Indeed, when one side is wholly depicted as responsible for a conflict, the ears of the other close. Too often, advocating commitment for the well-being of one equates to a blanket condemnation of the other. It no longer seems possible to be both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. For many months, I've been facilitating quiet meetings which have provided an opportunity for everyone to share with one another how events in Israel and Gaza have been affecting them and their communities here in the UK. My hope is to tackle the prevalence of mutual incomprehension and sometimes antipathy, as well as a reluctance to acknowledge different narratives. For example, such is the level of anxiety that some Jewish participants express concern that Muslim sympathy with Palestinians can be seen as threatening the Jewish community and feeding the rising anti-Semitism here in the UK. Likewise, Anxious Muslims view Jews as homogeneous in their support of Israel, unwilling to accept any criticism of the Jewish state. Most fail what Christos Stendhal, the former Bishop of Stockholm, called the interfaith test, the need to compare equal to equal, not my positive qualities over and against your negative ones. There is a deep reluctance to acknowledge the existence of prejudice against the other within each community, a strand of anti-Semitism amongst some Muslims and of Islamophobia amongst some Jews. However, I also recognized the sharedness of both communities' suffering. Listening to a Muslim woman saying she was fearful walking the streets of London wearing a hijab brought her Jewish neighbor to tears. A Muslim sitting next to a Jew was shocked to hear how his Jewish neighbor had taken down his mezuzah from the front door for fear of being targeted. There is no calculator of pain, one rabbi said, bringing nods from both imams and rabbis in the room. By the end of the discussion, both Muslims and Jews expressed a desire to keep the channels of dialogue open and to remain in touch with one another. It's striking how many emotions Jews, Christians, and Muslims share, such as worry, fear, and anger. They express similar concerns about the negative impact of social media and the importance of cross-communal friendship. Why it's so good here that we have a variety of different faiths in this room. The subject of personal security is commonly raised. Since October the 7th, I was told, I've only traveled on the tube if my kippah was covered by a hat. The two Muslims either side of him sighed in sympathy, familiar with being targeted due to being dressed differently. Finally, everyone expressed concern for the next generation, illustrated by a Christian mother tearfully saying, I worry for my daughter at university, in a very Jewish kind of way. Whilst I hope my students who study Jewish-Muslim relations or the participants in interfaith dialogue on the topic of Israel-Palestine are more confused at the end of their first discussion, I also hope they will have the confidence to overwhelm the shrill screams of advocacy, to overcome those who generate noise but not hope. This is the message of the Parents Circle, some of you may know, a grassroots organization of bereaved Palestinians and Israelis. And as an Israeli mother who lost her son and a Palestinian woman who lost her younger brother in the conflict once told my students, if you don't want to be part of the solution, don't be part of the problem. Hope is the vital ingredient that we can bring thousands of miles away from the conflict. It may be late to start talking, but it's not too late. A different type of dialogue goes on when you read Jewish commentaries. Whether it's the biblical commentators or Talmudic interpreters, what you read is a dialogue about what the text means. And in the surrounding small print, there is a dialogue about the dialogue. If I were to describe the literature of Judaism, it would be an anthology of dialogues. Sometimes these dialogues witness encounters between Jews and Christians more than 15 centuries ago. Take as an example the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, or the sacrifices, the attempted sacrifice of Isaac. The focus of the story is traditionally understood as Abraham's relationship with God and how his faith in and commitment to God was demonstrated by a willingness to sacrifice his long-awaited son at God's command. As a piece of writing, the biblical account has everything. It has tension, drama, enough action for a 5-act play or a Steven Spielberg blockbuster. And interpretations of the story demonstrate that Jews, Christians, and Muslims share an exegetical tradition. The biblical narrative has been important for Jews as early as the 3rd century, when it's been read on Rosh Hashanah. For Christians from the same period, the sacrifice of Isaac, as it's called, was mentioned in the Eucharistic prayers, and the story is read in the period leading up to Easter. And for Muslims, the festival of Eid al-Adha commemorates Ibrahim's willingness to sacrifice his son at God's command. Interpretations of this narrative provide an insight into the Abrahamic encounter because Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived and still live in a scripturally orientated culture. Similarities include an insistence on the harmony of Scripture and an emphasis on the unity of the text.
Interpretations were understandable to adherents of all Abrahamic religions, which is why Christian exegetes such as Origen and Jerome turned to Jewish contemporaries for help in translating the text. The emergence of Christianity out of Judaism, the advent of Islam in the Middle East, and the closeness between their scriptures create a platform upon which we can listen to a dialogue and perhaps also start new ones. Let me just give you one example. In verse 6, you'll know that Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. You know that one, right? I stopped to make sure you're still with me. Yes. Two strands of thought about Isaac are found in the Christian writings. First, he is a child, and in the second, a young man who had not yet reached adulthood. According to Cyril of Alexandria, who lived around the 5th century, Isaac was, and I quote, small and lying in the breast of his own father. While John Chrysostom, 150 years earlier, in Antioch, said Isaac had come of age and was in fact in the very bloom of youth. The rabbinic interpretation was significantly different. The rabbi stated that Isaac was 37 years of age. Another one gave his age as 26, and a third proposed 36. Unlike the biblical text, the rabbis consistently portray Isaac as an adult. Now, the significance of Isaac carrying the wood for Christians is understood, as you'd expect, as a model of Jesus carrying the cross. The rabbis also commented on this, and in Genesis Rabbah, 5th century Palestinian Midrash, I quote, and Abraham placed the wood of the burnt offering on Isaac his son, like a man who carries his cross on his shoulder. And the Hebrew word is tzeluv. And this rabbinic interpretation has clearly appropriated and modified the Christian interpretation, because the reference to a cross is as near an explicit reference to Christianity as you'll find in the rabbinic writings. But there's more. By depicting Isaac as an adult, the rabbis wanted to emphasize his willingness to be sacrificed, to suffer, to offer himself to his father. Isaac was not forced, but willingly gave himself to Abraham. Indeed, so willing was Isaac to give up his life that the rabbis described him as the blood of the binding of Isaac, or the ashes of Isaac. Well, this is startling to us all, because the biblical account explicitly states the angel stopped Abraham from harming his son, commanding him, don't do anything to Isaac. Yet, according to the 8th century Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, Isaac died. The angel was too late. He experienced resurrection, another illustration of the Christian interpretation on the Jewish. I quote, when the sword touched his neck, the soul of Isaac took flight and departed. But when he heard the voice from between the two cherubim saying, do not lay a hand, his soul returned to his body, and Abraham set him free, and he stood on his feet. And Isaac knew the resurrection of the dead, as taught by the Torah, that all the dead in the future would be revived. And at that moment, he opened his mouth and said, blessed are you, O Lord, Michiyei HaMeitim, who resurrects the dead, which is why Isaac, in the second blessing of the Amidah, is associated with the resurrection. So in conclusion, one of the reasons the relationship between Jews and Christians is significant is, in the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Jews and Christians are, in other words, inextricably linked. Nowhere more so than in our scriptures, and especially in their interpretations, because Jews and Christians lived and continue to live in this biblically orientated culture, albeit we interpret the scriptures very differently. And although there existed an abundance of texts which were polemical, the modern study of the comparative study of Jewish and biblical interpretation shows us that there is another more positive story to tell, that of a constructive two-way exegetical encounter, a meeting in the pages of Scripture in the formative centuries. Now, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Niels Bohr suggested that the opposite of a simple truth is a falsehood. But the opposite of a profound truth is very often another profound truth. And that's why we embrace, as Jews, both sides of what looks like a contradiction. When you see everything in terms of two dimensions, it's either true or it's false. And there can only be one perspective. And that's what dialogue rejects. There's always more than one perspective. Judaism regards that as fundamental to the nature of reality. If I'm standing here, things look differently to me from what you see sitting over there. We are seeing the world from different perspectives, and we're conferring dignity on how the world looks to me and how the world looks to you. The world, in other words, is an irreducible multiplicity of perspectives. There is, in other words, the view of Hillel, but also the view of Shammai, the view of Jacob, but also the view of Esau, the view of Adam, but also Eve. And ultimately, there is the point of view of us down here and the point of view of God up there. We try and do justice to the fact that there is more than one point of view. Now, supposing you and I see things differently. We have different perspectives on reality. Is that it? What can we do under those circumstances? Well, we can talk. We can converse. You can tell me how the world looks to me. You and I can tell you how the world looks to me. We can have a conversation. We can, through that conversation, learn what it feels like to be different, and we learn how to be different through dialogue. So, Judaism and Jewish thought is more than logical. It is, I suggest, dialogical. It gives dignity to the multiple perspectives from which we perceive reality. This is nothing less than embracing the principle of the irreducible multiplicity of perspectives. And unlike the escaped lion with whom I began, this results in forward, not lateral motion. Judaism proclaims the unity of God and the diversity of human existence. We Jews do not believe that out of the many come one. We believe that out of the one come many. And this, it seems to me, is the goal of genuine interfaith dialogue. Thank you.
I'm very interested to hear some of the rabbinic interpretations, which are not necessarily new to me, but you don't often hear those in Christian circles, and it's very interesting to hear those. But I know we will have some questions, and that's probably the best way to carry on the conversation.
You're going to run it around? Okay, so thank you very much to both our speakers. Yoni, you're going to help me, right? Because he's fitter than I am. And I can say this to the Jews, questions means questions, not midrashim or long statements. Of course, Christians always answer questions immediately, but so try and think about that, give our speakers time. Questions, there was one over here.
My question was actually for both of you to dialogue a little, if you wouldn't mind, just to pick up and share with us what you've heard and understood from each other, not necessarily that surprised you, but that you'd like to take further.
Excellent non-question. Instruction. What's the question? What's the instruction? You want to dialogue, right?
Well, perhaps we could turn it around and say, what is there that we would... One of the things that certainly I've valued, and I know many other Christians involved in dialogue have valued, is understanding a bit more about Jewish interpretations of texts. I mean, we've had a wonderful expose on the Akedah, and that's one of them. And I, for example, one of the things that I've learned particularly is to ask questions of the text, to interrogate the text. And you talked about the questions of how old was Isaac. That's something that I think is very interesting. Was Isaac able to overpower Abraham should he have wished to? So what is there about the obedience of Isaac that also comes into that story? But one of the stories that I particularly like is that was told to me in dialogue over texts is the story of where Laban is sent to look for a wife, and he's told to select a wife who offers to water the camels. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the question. The question that I should ask the text is, how much does a camel drink? He's not looking for a kind-hearted woman. He's looking at somebody who can really build a nation. And these are the sorts of things. I think a revitalization of the Hebrew scriptures is what I've particularly learnt. What I would like to learn is, I think, in terms of further dialogue, is how can we learn about obedience? I think, how do we see obedience? How is it turned up? How is it put together with love? So I understand about obeying the Torah, but loving the Torah. How are these compatible, and how does that relate to our relationship with the Almighty? So I don't know if that answers your question at all from that perspective.
Thanks, Jane. Well, I suppose, Jeff, what I would pick up from Jane most of all is this point about crossing the threshold, that she would take her students and participants in FODIP across the threshold into a synagogue or into a mosque, into a place they've not been to before. Because so many of our perspectives are what we think we know. And that's why I wanted to sort of emphasize the confusion rather than knowing the answer before we start. So I think what Jane does in terms of encouraging these encounters, and there's something that I think is so valuable, is crossing that threshold. In terms of obedience, I'm trying to think, we Jews aren't very good at being obedient. And even the very word Israel, as you know, means someone struggling with God. And when you quoted Leviticus 19:18, love the neighbor as yourself, such a famous verse, I always think of, why does everybody get so hung up with loving the neighbor? It's not so difficult to love your neighbors. I mean, it's not easy, but it's not that difficult. But that's why the Torah says love the stranger 36 times, because it's a lot harder. And for those of us who've engaged, for example, in refugee work, and I know some people here have, you know how difficult it is. And if we Jews in particular can't love the stranger, then we've lost that memory of what it is to be strangers. And I always think of that the fact that it's like 36 times, but everybody talks about loving the neighbor. It's a lot harder to love the stranger, which is why it's said on 36 times, you're commanded to love the stranger.
Indeed. If I just add on that, this is another example of how Christians have often read their own scriptures, as well as Hebrew scriptures, from an anti-Judaic perspective. And it's possible to read from a pro-Judaic perspective, which I've always pushed and tried to model and exemplify. But of course, the command to love your neighbor in the New Testament comes from a famous story of Jesus, of the Good Samaritan. And as a Christian, I learned that the idea is that the person you least expect to be your neighbor, to behave in a neighborly way, is in fact the stranger. But I have sadly heard of many people who've been told that, and Jews too, as well as Christians, that actually that parable is an anti-Judaic parable, saying how the rabbi, the Levite walked past, and it was somebody else, a Gentile almost, who actually saved the man. Now that's terrible. And it's not in the original text. So my mission always to Christians is to say, just think about how the original people who heard those and spoke about those and told those stories would have understood them. And that, I think, is something of the message that we still need to get across. Sorry to take so long on that one question. Good one.
Good afternoon. Sadly, I'm thinking about the endless rounds of violence in the Middle East, and what can we learn from Jewish and Christian traditions that might offer some hope that some of that violence may not cease, but at least diminish.
Shall I kick off?
I see you'll get me for that one.
Thank you, Paul. Of course, within our traditions, there are plenty of texts, and we heard it in the prayer Richard offered us earlier about praying for the peace and pursuing peace. I think the way I would approach it from a my perspective of interfaith relations is a recognition that the conflict will cease at some point. There will be an outburst of peace, a moment, maybe days, maybe weeks, but there will be this outburst of peace, maybe presented as temporary peace. That's the moment we have to build the relations. But I'll be honest, Paul, that most of my time personally is spent here because of the transfer of conflict from one place to another. Why was it there were riots in Leicester in 2022? Because of an incident in India between Hindus and Muslims, transferred to the streets of Leicester, like that. Why is it there has been an upsurge in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism? Essentially because of the reaction to the conflict in Israel and Gaza. And my worry and my work and my priority is very much about ensuring relations here are maintained between communities, because we are under a lot of pressure. A lot of groups have fractured, been unable to meet, and one of the lessons of them, I think, Paul, is that we haven't tackled the difficult issues enough. And the work that Jane does with Phobic and one or two other organizations puts that elephant at the center of a conversation. Some of my students train going to the church, some are imams from local Muslim college. And one of the first things I say is when you go into a Jewish community, don't start with Israel, Palestine. You've got to build relationships. That's why it's great to have the civic leaders here and the MP to build relations with your community, understand your community. Let them know that you're there, the leaders are there. Too often we're failed by our national leaders, without mentioning any names. We've got to do it from the bottom up. And one final word, because the Wolf Institute did some research about how you measure the impact of interfaith dialogue. You know, as you know, Paul, I've devoted most of my life to dialogue, so I hope it makes a blinking difference. But how do we know? And one of the ways that we know is because it's more effective, as good as it is for the Grand Mufti to meet the Pope and then, you know, the Chief Rabbi. It's a great moment, nice photo opportunity moment. But that's not dialogue. It's important, but it's not dialogue. What happens on the street is dialogue. What happens in our local communities is dialogue. What happens in a local church? We've got the Catholic priest here today. What happens in the local church and the local synagogue, the civic community? It's on the ground, it's locally. So when there is a crisis, who is it that provides the food, the homeless shelter, the soup kitchen? More often than not, it's the faith communities. And even if they're held in a secular space, more often than not, they are practicing observant Jews and Christians and Muslims who are doing that work. And that is a ground for hope.
Thank you. Yes, and just to add a little bit onto that, as you've heard, I founded the Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine, ODIP, and when all this occurred, some of our projects that we were running had to pause for obvious reasons. And the particularly difficult ones were the young people. The young people wanted to meet, Jews, Christians, Muslims, they wanted to meet, but when they met, they didn't know how to speak to each other. They didn't know what to say to each other that wouldn't hurt or offend the other. And so they took the decision to step back, maintaining they're still on social media, but they only talk about personal, non-related issues. They keep the relationship, and that's why I say the relationships are important, as Ed has highlighted too. They can't actually talk to each other, and I think, and often we've seen that we've been brought in to help with interfaith organizations that can't now have the dialogue. They say, well, how do we talk to each other? Why are these people so angry with me? What have I said in our group? And I've been with them, talking to them for years, and now they don't know what to say to me, or they don't speak to me. Why is it? And this is a terrible thing that we'd have to just, as Ed said, write this out. But the relationships stay. We run a traditional a sports program for women from traditional backgrounds, so Muslim and Jewish women predominantly, but not exclusively, who can't actually go to gyms or join in ordinary sports activities, can come together in a safe women-only space and play sport. And they've still done that. They've still been meeting. even though, some subjects are just off the table. But those relationships are important, and please God, in good time, people can come back together again.
We have a very good number of people on Zoom, so if they want to ask questions, they do so indicate to our team at the back, made up of our chairman, Mark Shaw. He'll be able to assist you with questions that come through on the Zoom. Do we have... I'll take one there. Right, get there quicker.
Thank you so much for your messages of hope. It was really inspiring to hear all of that. I was wondering, Ed, you said that anger and fear are emotions that connect us. They also really divide us at the moment. If I look at the demonstrations and the protests, the anger is really scary. For me as a Christian, I can only try and imagine what it feels like for my Jewish friends. And that fear then divides us even further. And recently on a podcast, you said that what we've not done in the past is really address those differences. How do we bring those differences into something that then brings us back together in this awful moment where we're so far apart?
Thank you, Sandra. I think what I've found in the groups where we've had conversations since 7th of October is that each side, as it were, has heard the anger and fear of the other. And even if I think you're more responsible, even primarily responsible for my fear, for the first time I can see that you also have a fear. And that's a link. It's not a divider, it's a link. You're absolutely right that when the communities don't meet, and too often the leaders are encouraging us not to meet, and for those of us who are devoted to dialogue, we're really being squeezed and under a lot of pressure from people who shouldn't be putting us under pressure. My father said to me, what do we need a Centre for Jewish-Christian Relations for? We need the Centre for Jewish-Jewish Relations, So we're under pressure from within our communities as well as across our communities for those of us committed and touched by the angel of dialogue. But I think that sense of fear and anger is shared. Now, what do you do? When you see 200,000 people demonstrate and walk around London shouting placards, a number of us see those placards which are either anti-Semitic or they interpret certain words to be anti-Semitic. Others of us see the same words and don't feel the same thing. They see it's remarkable that 200,000 people are marching and only a small number of those 200,000 people are coming up with racist, anti-Semitic, or some kind of slogan that's not offensive. It depends how you want to see it. What I do when I'm in a position, I can keep a sense of humor. And it's really important. But what I do when we begin a conversation is simply start with what we have in common. What do we share? But then the mistake is to stop there. Once we've established this relationship, you know me a little bit, I know you a little bit, I've got a little understanding of who Sandra is, who Julius is, then we can go to where we differ, how we approach things differently. I think the mistake that's been made in the interfaith world is too often stopping with the commonality and not managing the difference. We have to manage the difference better. I don't agree with you, but I'm not going to go into a dialogue saying that. I want to know who you are. It's very easy. You just go in and say, tell me your story, and you shut up. Who doesn't want to share their story? Most of us find it difficult to shut up. And having done that, having heard your story, then hopefully you say to me, tell me your story. And we begin the dialogue. But it begins with what we have in common, but it must not stop there. It has to move on to where we differ.
Another thing about dialogue, of course, is that it involves both vulnerability and generosity. You make yourself vulnerable if you go into dialogue with somebody. You might be challenged. You might feel yourself somewhat on dodgy ground. But you also have to be generous to the other person. And at the moment, there's so much pain. A lot of people are feeling real pain, and it's difficult to admit your vulnerability or to be generous when you're in pain. And I think recognizing the fact that at times. Just as very quickly, a brief story. I had a friend who lived in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and he was training to be a priest. He was a seminarian, and he worked with a wonderful priest, really very, very exemplary guy, full of compassion and wisdom. One day they heard that somebody in the congregation had lost a son. And the priest, unfortunately, was somewhere else. He was quite a way away and couldn't go. And they said to this young guy, "Could you just go round to the family?" And this absolutely terrified him, because he hadn't got the first idea of what he was going to say. He'd got all his theology, of course, in his head, all this wonderful Christian theology. And so he went to the family, and he started, obviously, you know, they were devastated. They were in floods of tears. And he started to sort of give them words that he thought were words of hope or understanding or whatever. And he could tell he wasn't getting anywhere. And then there was a knock at the door, and unfortunately, the real priest was there, and he'd heard about this, and he'd come over. So the ordinary said, "Well, this is brilliant. I'll now understand exactly what I've got to say in these situations." And of course, the priest just came in. He just opened his arms, and he just hugged the family. Mm. And sometimes that's all we can do. Yeah.
Thank you. So religions at the moment seem to have their fair share of fundamentalists. So I wonder whether you can separately say a bit about your experience with fundamentalists and whether there's any possibility of dialogue with them.
Thank you. Great question. I would say not only religions have their fair share of fundamentalists. We find that in our politics. We find that in the secular world, and religion's no different. We do. So the first thing I'd say is not unique to religion. In fact, the rise of religious extremism is not an Abrahamic phenomenon. It's find it in India with Hindu nationalism. You find it in Myanmar with Buddhist violence and nationalism. So this is a global phenomenon which is a religious and also non-religious phenomenon. Now, how do we deal with it? The first thing is to be literate. So we've done quite a lot of work with the Foreign Office, I think you might have done as well, Jane, in terms of training diplomats. Madeleine Albright famously said, "I have specialists in the history of a country I go to, in the economics of the country, in the politics of the country. I have dress books with lots of military people in it, but I don't know anything about the religion. We have no training on religion." And so from 15, 20 years ago, the American diplomatic service, and also under William Hague, the Foreign Office began to do training on religion and belief for diplomats. Sounds obvious, but it wasn't at that time. And one of the things that we taught was the ability to navigate and to be literate in religion and belief. It's not just about knowing the 613 commandments, not that I know them all. It's not about knowing, just the knowledge, but it's about building relationships with people of faith of all types, whether progressive, whether orthodox, whether Haredi. You need to be able to navigate, you need to be able to understand. You need to be able to speak in a language that they understand. So there's a certain amount on us to be able to navigate that diversity within our faith and other faiths, and also not to be put off by the prejudice within ours and other communities about those who are more fundamentalist. A Muslim friend of mine, Ibrahim Mogra, you know Ibrahim, who is an imam, starts his class when he teaches my students by saying, "I want you to know I'm a jihadist." And everyone goes, and then he unpacks what the word jihadi means, someone who struggles. That's all it means, someone who strives. Now, of course, some people take it to the extreme of being actively violent against others, often within their own faith tradition as well as others, but you have to understand what those terms mean. So you have to be able to navigate, be able to engage.
and to be able to talk in those arenas, the strictly observant arenas, rather than I would call fundamentalist. Some of the most interesting dialogue, and I'll stop, Jane, some of the most interesting dialogue that I've been involved in the US has been in Texas. With some of those people you were talking about, call themselves Christian Zionists, but, you know, who found it very hard that I, as a Jew, could talk about Romans 9-11 and Paul of Tarsus and not be Christian. It was quite important for them to hear that from a Jewish voice. And they'd asked me what kind of Jew I was. Eventually I had to say I'm a Jewish Jew. You know, so it's working out a way to navigate those different areas.
And I think, yes, some people are just not interested in dialogue. They're never going to do it. They're never going to get it. And, you know, there's a little Christian phrase about shaking the dust off your feet. You know, if you go somewhere and it's not working, move on. But it just reminded me when you spoke about Ibrahim Mogra, when I was first interviewed for a job at the Council of Christians and Jews, I was interviewed by Paul Mendel, who was the then director. Some of you may remember him. And so it came to the end of the interview and he'd said, you know, well, we'd very much like to welcome you on board. And then he thought to say, he said, I presume you're a liberal Christian. And I said, no, I come from the evangelical wing. And the look on his face was absolutely wonderful. But fortunately, I didn't prove to be the cuckoo in the nest.
We've got time for one final question.
I'm a Catholic and member of Council of Christians and Jews. And I stand with Israel, and I'm sorry what happened 7th of October. And I'm sorry what Jews experienced throughout the history and expulsion from Europe. And in Middle Ages in Jerusalem, they were expelled until Third Crusade. Sorry, I'm a bit emotional, because this is very important for me to say within Jews and Christians. And Jews were expelled then from the 13th century by Ottoman Empire. And I'm sorry about that experience, horrible experience. So what I want to say is that we have much more in common, our three Abrahamic religions, than what I heard here. We are different, we want this, we want this. I deeply believe that Christians have so much in common with the Jews and with Muslims, but I'm talking now about religion, about connection with Jews and Christians. Yes, I have questions. So I'm thinking about Christians and Jews now and in current time in Israel and in West Bank and Gaza. So Christians are squashed between fire, between Hamas and Israel. So I'm just wondering, because we are talking about dialogue. So to do the dialogue, we need to be alive. So, yes. So I'm just wondering, is it any way that we could help Christians in West Bank, because they are Islamized and they are terrorized by Hamas for a long time? So how we can help Jews and Christians in
How can we use Christians in the Middle East?
Just to say very quickly, thank you for that. And there are many organisations that are working in the region, and one of the sad things is that they can't now meet very easily or communicate very easily. But there are good organisations working, and many of us here are in communication constantly with them, and are looking for ways to support. So there are ways.
I am as well.
Thank you very much for that question. And I just to add one final remark, and this is in terms of three people meet every afternoon in Jerusalem for a cup of coffee. And they look around them and they look, as you say, there's all this violence around them, everything's a mess, and they decide they're three pessimists. And one day, one of them turns to his friends and says, you know what, I've converted. He said, what do you mean you've converted? He said, I've become an optimist. And they say, how can you be an optimist? There's so many terrible things going on. And he said, well, look, we're old friends. You've got to accept me for who I am. And they do, and then a few minutes later, they look at this newly converted optimist. He looks like me, a few wrinkles, grey hairs. And they say to him, why do you look so worried if you're an optimist? He said, you think it's easy to be an optimist? And it seems to me, as a person of faith, and as people of faith in this room, whether we're Jews, Christians, of any faith tradition, optimism and hope is what we have to hang on to, even at the darkest times. And to hear a Christian and a Jew together, to engage, friendship between us, respect between us, the different work that we do, that Jane and I have for one another, which I hope you sensed here today, is grounds for hope. And the work that so many people here are doing, the presence of people online, in person, what you have to do now is take it forward. You have to make a difference in the locale, wherever you are, to build relations, particularly at a time that's difficult, but always to hang on to that hope. Thank you.
Now it's working. Right, well, it falls to me to close this little session and to say thank you to our two amazing speakers. I'm not quite sure how I follow what's just taken place, but thank you for a very interesting, very informative, very thought-provoking, challenging session. Yeah, I think ours actually is the privilege and the honour to have had you to talk to us. So you've given us much to think about on quite a complex topic. So hopefully we can do it justice and take forward that message of hope and do what we can do in order to make things better in the future. So thank you. Thank you also to you, the audience, and to all of you on Zoom for your questions and your participation. I'd also like to just say a quick thank you to our very committed committee, small but enthusiastic, working hard behind the scenes to bring all this together. And also to provide a very nice tea, which you are all cordially invited to over in the Schindler Hall now, I believe. Thank you.